But yeah, I'm really happy to present, and I hope you can see the slides okay, on my project, which is Redressing Ageism. It's a UKRI funded work for a catalyst. It was a Catalyst Award, so we got a small amount of money to do some insight work into looking at the problems that businesses have when thinking about tackling ageism in fashion industry. So firstly, you don't have to look very far to get kind of these images like this I'm showing you. I don't know if anyone has actually started looking at what the latest trends are for this year. Now that the summer or spring is finally here, you might be thinking about refreshing your wardrobes. And even if you have a look at some of the latest trends, these are the kind of images that you'll see. This is one from Vogue, but this kind of image, these kind of catwalk images are replicated in a lot of different magazines. And you'll see that there is a lack of diversity in terms of shape and size of models that we are that are shown to us in the media. There is now more ethnic diversity, but you'll see that there's next to no kind of age diversity here. And this is really interesting because what we wear and how we dress ourselves to reflect, our personalities, who we are. And if we don't see ourselves represented in an industry like the fashion industry, then we might think that we're kind of being excluded from it, or not for us, and we're not really attracting those kind of consumers that we might want. That have all the cash, as Elsa described earlier. So ageism in fashion tends to kind of be shown in kind of three kind of things. One is about the representation of older people. We did a report for media representations and stereotypes of older persons, and underrepresentation is really key. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that older consumers and older people are just underrepresented in this industry. When there is representation, sometimes there is quite a lot of misrepresentation. So people kind of being represented in the same kind of light, and a lack of diversity in that representation. So we might be seeing older models. When we do see them, they might be adhering to kind of beauty standards that we're used to seeing, and very little beyond that. So they might be adhering to some of these beauty norms, like being really tall, being really slim. So a lack of invisibility is something that we quite often hear, and something also that Elsa picked out on with that quote in that first talk. Another theme that we tend to see is around devaluing. So this kind of devaluing of aging bodies, this kind of anti-aging terms, and anything kind of just inherently says that the signs of aging are bad, and anything that we can kind of do to reduce them are good. And within that, there's this heavy kind of focus on youth. So one of the things that I was thinking about from Anthony's talk was, the focus there for those tribes is not on youth having that kind of high status, whereas in our culture and with fashion, we tend to see that the status and the focus is very much like on youth. So what would happen if we actually flipped that around? And then the other thing that you tend to see in terms of ageism in fashion in the literature is around dissatisfaction. So this is really on the consumer side of things, clothes that don't really fit aging bodies, and clothes that don't really reflect the desires and needs and personalities of people as they get older. So these are the kind of things that we tend to see in the literature when we're talking about ageism in fashion. And so to try and tackle some of these things, we thought, well, what is it about businesses that mean that they are being ageist, and what are the challenges that they face in terms of, if we said, hey, you're being ageist, what are you going to do about it? What are the kind of challenges that they might say? And how do they also, we're interested in thinking about how defend themselves from some of these ageist practices. So in talking to a couple of brands, we learned that there seems to be a kind of mentality in the fashion industry that we're not ageist. Okay, so we really wanted to understand with our Redressing Ageism in Fashion project, what is it that the businesses understand? How do they think about ageism? How do they understand ageism? What kind of challenges would they actually face if we said, okay, well, let's try and address ageism in the industry? What kind of things would they say? Well, we can't do that because. Then whether or not we could kind of create and test some solutions to help fashion businesses kind of address some of these challenges. So the first thing that we did, having spoken to a couple of brands, is actually create a survey for industry professionals. And one of the brands that we partnered with for this was the Bias Cut, which runs. So in our survey for industry professionals, we wanted to know and learn how they think about ageism. How do they actually understand ageism within their industry? Do they even recognize it? Do they even see it as a problem? We wanted to understand what the challenges that they face if they were going to try and tackle ageism. And then we wanted to know whether they were interested in some solutions. And importantly, we also wanted to understand whether or not they actually thought that this was a problem that the industry could tackle themselves, whether they should be tackling it, or whether or not it's something that they didn't think would actually change. So we wanted to know whether or not they had whether they envisaged that the industry actually had the power to change. So in our survey, we managed to get 69 responses from people working in the industry, and the survey was shared by the Bias Cut through various kind of social media channels, but also we managed to share through some channels, which meant that we got some retail workers and some people working within the fashion industry to take part. So what I'm going to show you is under each of those themes, some of the findings that we had. And this is very kind of high level descriptive kind of data that we've got. We're now trying to, these findings might change a little bit. But when it comes to thinking about understanding ageism, we had a number of items based on the literature that we reviewed that asked people about those things that we discussed at the beginning. So representation, devaluing, and about consumer choices. And we found overwhelmingly really high levels of agreement that the industry is youth-centric, and that it and that's the way that the fashion industry is structured. High levels of agreement with the fact that there's underrepresentation, that beauty kind of tends to shun older women and value youth, that the aging body is ignored, and that image editing practices are commonplace in the fashion industry. Okay, so these things that I've got here clustered together, actually statistically they kind of clustered together under one theme, which we called this value orientation, which the fashion industry tends to value younger and then ignore what is older. Other age appropriateness and age norms. So 97% of the people that took part in our survey agreed that women are often subjected to these unrealistic standards of ideal appearance. So that's pretty much everybody apart from one person that they agreed with this. So pretty high level of agreement. And that there are strong norms that define what is and what is not appropriate for older women to wear. Okay, what's interesting here is kind of thinking about where these norms come from. So they're coming from within the industry themselves. And obviously we know that the fashion industry every year sets new norms about what we should and shouldn't be wearing. So isn't the fashion industry a really interesting place to think about how we might try and change and tackle some of these norms? So why or why not might they want to do that? I think that's kind of a really interesting question. And that's where we came to think about. So if we were to ask industry about that, what would they say? We came up with a whole list of different challenges that were based on the literature, but also based on some sort of early interviews that we did with different businesses. And we had a group of things that were around, about just challenges and access of older models. What if we don't see older models on catwalks and in promotion pictures and in media and advertising campaigns because there aren't any? Well, that seems to be not necessarily the case. So very few people agreed that it's actually hard to find older models. So it doesn't seem to be an issue around access. There does seem to be something about it being maybe perhaps a little bit easier to create what we call contemporary looks or aesthetically pleasing looks with younger models. But this doesn't seem to really be a challenge that businesses face. What did come out quite a little bit more strongly was a lack of understanding in the industry. So we can see from our previous work that they do understand what ageism is, but there's a lack of awareness and understanding about how to tackle it and how to do something about it. So if we said to the industry, do you even know what age inclusivity looks like? Then they might struggle. And that's something that perhaps we should be looking at, is actually trying to define that for the industry. 75% said that there's a lack of understanding regarding what older consumers want or need. So there's still quite a high level of agreement that even within the industry, we don't really know what older consumers want or need. So this is probably because of that youth orientation and that youth focus. High levels of agreement that aging is seen as undesirable. So if an aging bodies are seen as undesirable and uncool, then why would we put it into campaigns that we want to promote different clothes for? Interestingly, we thought that there would be more agreement to these two things here about consumers maybe having a more positive views of brands if it's represented by younger models, and younger consumers maybe instinctively disconnecting from brands if they see older models. These are two things that we thought that from speaking to brands in our first stage, that came out quite strongly, that there might be a fear associated, that brands might fear being associated with consumers, or fear using imagery, using images of older adults, because it kind of changes what their brand means and how their brands are seen. So that's kind of interesting. And then there was quite a lot of agreement that practices are so entrenched that they're a challenge to kind of change and to reorientate those practices. 85% said that designers and brands are fearful of being associated with older consumers because they believe it will taint their image and relevance. So these are some of the challenges that the businesses face. So they might want to reach older consumers, but there's a challenge and a way to do that without kind of alienating young consumers, or without. So I'll just go talk through the survey findings. I did have some other studies, but I'll just stick with this. So I was going through the business challenges, and I think what I was trying to get at with just reflecting back on the previous speaker, it's interesting that people kind of you create these products and then you don't quite set enough money aside to actually and pay enough money for the photography and everything, and people don't realize how expensive it is. So these, in the fashion industry, you know, there is so much money that goes into creating the right light, the right lighting, and the right photography that you just don't see when it comes to perhaps clothing for older people. So they don't have the right look, which is the interesting part. So anyway, so fear of being associated with older people because they think it will taint their image is something that we've been looking at and looking to potentially challenge with some experimental research. But solutions, the top one you can see, or the second from top one, is about how to create these aesthetic and stylish looks with age diverse models. So this is something that there are some photographers that will be doing this really, really well. The Bias Cut does this really well. Some other brands use age diverse models, and they do so really, really well. These tend to be those kind of smaller brands that are not breaking through into the mainstream. So what's interesting is that if we look at the large fashion houses, they won't be doing this. But if we look at smaller fashion brands, perhaps those that are only operating on Instagram or perhaps have a sustainability kind of ethical fashion focus, they do diversity well and do it much better. But this seems to be an area where there is kind of a point for learning about. Again, it wasn't really about improving access to models. That didn't seem to be much of an issue. Something there about trying to learn about how to age diversify the image without losing kind of your value and losing what your brand actually means. So there is something around that. Then power to change. Interestingly, a lot of people said that wider representation of older women actually working in the fashion industry would help. So if there was sort of more change led from the inside, and I think we're seeing a bit of that now. And also 94% of people agreed that the fashion industry could play a leading role in tackling ageism. So this is something really interesting as well, because we're seeing that actually if we empower businesses somehow to take this kind of seriously, then they could actually be leading the way and challenging ageism. If we challenge ageism in fashion, then we could be challenging ageism in other areas of society as well. So that's also interesting. There was less agreement that attitudes needed to change. So one of the things that fashion brands tend to say is that actually the attitudes of our consumers, like if we all stopped being a bit ageist, then that would help. So there does seem to be a bit of power to change. So just to summarize that kind of bit of work, the ageism in fashion kind of manifests through this underrepresentation, this kind of devaluing of aging through the norms that define what is appropriate. It's not necessarily about access to older models. If you actually look at a lot of modeling agencies, there are lots of agencies now that promote models of different ages. It's more about how to actually create kind of these aesthetic and stylish images when you have visible signs of aging. Many agree that businesses are fearful of being associated with older markets or with images of older people. Actually, only half agreed that younger consumers would disconnect from brands that use older models. And that's something that I can show next, is that we've actually been doing some work looking at how we view clothes that are worn by younger and older models. So if I just use one minute, I will just show one finding which we've replicated. So we did some studies in which we showed people two images of a younger and older model. So they either shown the older model or the younger model, and they were shown the picture of these clothes that were worn by the models. We had all female participants, and they evaluated the age of the models, so they were seen as different in age, and they evaluated how fashionable they thought appropriate the clothes were for the models, but also how appropriate the clothes were for themselves. And interestingly, we found that the clothes were evaluated as equally fashionable, but there is this thing about what's appropriate. So the clothes were seen as less appropriate for the older model and slightly less kind of traditional for the older model than for the younger model. But what these kind of findings are telling us is that actually it's not changing how we view the fashionableness of the clothes. So this idea that young and youth and fashion sort of situate with it alongside each other, and that if you want to be seen as a fashionable brand, then you must use younger models for your clothes, it is not coming out in our research. So actually the fashionableness and how trendy the clothes were seen was equal, didn't matter whether it was shown by the younger or older model, but it's still, there's this notion of what's appropriate that's still there. So it's slightly seen as less appropriate for the older model. But of course, the more that we see it and the more that we're exposed to it, the more that these views might change, and then these norms around what's appropriate might change. So I was